Hi, I'm Bill with Reeves Artist Materials, and I'm here at Nasco today to talk to you about the difference between watercolor and gouache. There's a lot of confusion as to what gouache actually is. It's very similar to watercolor, but it's more opaque and it dries to a flat matte finish. So you get brilliance of color, but with a flat, without the depth of brilliance that you get with watercolor. And to show you what I mean, I'm going to use yellow ochre. Yellow ochre is a great color in watercolor. You get a rich variance of color. It applies beautifully, and it's a color that lots of artists use. So when we put this on our paper, you can see you get this great golden yellow color. Now, when I use gouache, the color is very similar. They're both yellow ochre, but it's going to appear much flatter without the depth and the transparency that you get in watercolor. So now these are both wet, but you see the great transparent depth that you get in the watercolor version as opposed to the flat opaqueness of gouache. So lots of brilliant color here, but lacking the depth of watercolor. And if we look at these colors dry, you can see a drastic difference. Watercolor on the right, you get great transparency, great beautiful golden colors. Gouache on the left, a matte solid block of color. So if you want lots of color, gouache is great. But if you want that transparency and depth of color, watercolor is actually your best friend. So to show you more about the differences between gouache and watercolor, I'm going to do a very quick wet-on-wet color mixing project. It's also a simple and easy painting to introduce into your classroom. On the right side, I'll be using watercolor. On the left side, I'll be using gouache. The first thing I'm going to do is wet my paper. And I'm just using a standard 3/4 inch watercolor brush. I'm going to wet the paper. And I'm going to work light into dark. So the first color I'm going to put down is going to be my primary yellow. I'm going to do watercolor first, and I'm going to make one stroke from one side of the page to the other, and just let these colors kind of flow on the wet page. I'm going to do the same thing with the gouache. And what you're going to see with the gouache is that the color is much more intense and much more brilliant. Now I'm going to move into my primary red. And when I do that, I'm going to let the colors flow and blend together. And since they're primary colors, we should get some secondary colors in here as well. So working from one side of the page to the other with the gouache, I'm going to work into the yellow, and you can see the colors start to flow and blend together very nicely. And I'm going to do the same thing with the watercolor. So working onto the wet surface, and you can see the watercolor is not quite as brilliant as the gouache. What you're going to notice is a much more subtle blending of the colors. And then lastly, I'll move into my primary blue. I'm going to start with the gouache, just working from one side of the paper to the next. And then when I get into the red, I'm going to start getting a little violet or maroon color there. And you can see the color is much more intense and much more opaque in the gouache than it is in the watercolor. And here's my watercolor with the blue, and I'll work right into the red. You can see it's a much more subtle transition with the watercolor, not so bright and as tense. Not so bright. It's a much more subtle transition with the watercolor. The colors flow together and blend a little more nicely than they do with the intense gouache color. So when these are dry, you can really see a difference. Gouache is intense, but the colors are matte, and there's a very hard distinction between moving from primary color to primary color. With the watercolor, the colors are not quite so intense, but they're more depth, and they're more subtle, and you get a nice subtle color mixture between colors. So we've used watercolor and gouache to create these wet-on-wet color mixes. They've dried, and now we're going to introduce black as a silhouette or shadow to create a dramatic piece of artwork that you can easily do in your classroom. First, I'm going to use watercolor, and I'm going to use straight black. And starting at the lightest part of my painting, I'm just going to introduce what would be considered the shadow of a landscape. So we've created earth down here. And you can see the black with the watercolor is transparent. It's going to be very shadowy and kind of deep. I'm going to create, let's just create a tree with black. And then I'll move to a finer brush to create some of the details. And with your brush, just keep flowing. You're going to get different shades of black that will create dramatic effects. So this should be an easy enough piece of art that any skill level in your classroom can be able to accomplish it, but teach color mixing and teach light to dark, teach shadows, so lots of different concepts here. So you can see with the watercolor, it's not opaque, very shadowy, but still very dramatic. With gouache, it's going to be more inky. It's going to be very opaque. And you'll see a significant difference, especially with the black. So when we create a landscape, you can see how much darker the gouache is. Really opaque and really covers the color underneath. We'll do the same thing. We'll create a tree, maybe make this one a little bit different. But you can see the difference, much more opaque, much more dramatic in terms of light and dark. So, watercolor, transparent, subtle color changes, very deep and rich in color. Gouache, very intense color, very opaque, not as subtle in terms of the way the color mixes, but very dark